Welcome back to GCC Kids Connection, where we are connecting with each other while you're home from school. We're connecting with some really cool books, and most importantly, we're connecting with God's Word. We're so glad you're here.
Well, hi kids, welcome back. Here we are at the last two chapters in our book called Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. Last time we found out that Wilbur won a very special prize, and we're pretty sure now that Wilbur's life is going to be spared. So we're ready to begin with chapter 21 and 22, and the title of this chapter is called Last Day. Charlotte and Wilbur were alone. The families had gone to look for Fern. Templeton was asleep, and Lurvy lay resting after the excitement and strain of the ceremony. His medal hung around his neck. By looking out the corner of his eye, Wilbur could see it. "Charlotte," said Wilbur after a while, "why are you so quiet?" "I like to sit still," she said. "I've always been rather quiet." "Yes, but you seem specially so today. Do you feel all right?" "A little tired, perhaps, but I feel peaceful. Your success in the ring this morning was, to a small degree, my success. Your future is assured. You'll live secure and safe, Wilbur. Nothing will harm you now. These autumn days will shorten and grow cold. The leaves will shake loose from the trees and fall. Christmas will come, and then the snows of winter. You'll live to enjoy the beauty of the frozen world. For you mean a great deal to Zuckerman, and he will not harm you ever. Winter will pass, and the days will lengthen, and the ice will melt in the pasture pond, and song sparrows will return and sing. The frogs will awaken. The warm wind will blow again. All these sights and sounds and smells will be yours to enjoy, Wilbur. This lovely world, these precious days." Charlotte stopped. A moment later, a tear came to Wilbur's eye. "Oh, Charlotte," he said, to think that when I first met you, I thought you were cruel and bloodthirsty." When he recovered from his emotion, he spoke again. "Why did you do all this for me?" he asked. "I don't deserve it. I've never done anything for you." "You have been my friend," replied Charlotte. "That in itself is a tremendous thing. I wove my webs for you because I liked you. After all, what's a life anyway? We're born, we live a little while, we die. A spider's life can't help being something of a mess with all the trapping and eating of flies. By helping you, perhaps I was just trying to lift my own life a trifle. Heaven knows everybody's life can stand a little of that." "Well," said Wilbur, "I'm no good at making speeches. I haven't got the gift of words. But you have saved me, Charlotte, and I would gladly give my life for you. I really would." "I'm sure you would, and I thank you for your generous sentiments." "Charlotte," said Wilbur, "we're all going home today. The fair is almost over. Won't it be wonderful to be back home in the barn cellar again with the sheep and the geese? Aren't you anxious to get home?" For a moment, Charlotte said nothing. Then she spoke in a voice so low that Wilbur could hardly hear her words. "I will not be going back to the barn," she said. Wilbur leapt to his feet. "Not going back!" he cried. "Charlotte, what are you talking about?" "I'm done for," she replied. "In a day or two I'll be dead. I haven't even enough strength to climb down to the crate. I doubt that I have enough silk in my spinnerets to even lower myself to the ground." Hearing this, Wilbur threw himself down in agony and pain of sorrow. Great sobs racked his body. He heaved and he grunted with desolation. "Charlotte," he moaned, "Charlotte, my true friend." "Come now, let's not make a scene," said the spider. "Be quiet, Wilbur. Stop thrashing about." "But I can't stand it," shouted Wilbur. "I won't leave you here to die. If you're going to stay here, I'm going to stay too." Don't be ridiculous, said Charlotte. You can't stay here. Zuckerman, Lurvy, and John Arble and the others will be back any minute now, and they'll shove you into that crate and away you'll go. Besides, it wouldn't make any sense for you to stay. There would be no one to feed you. The fairgrounds will soon be empty and deserted. Wilbur was in a panic. He raced round and around the pen. Suddenly, he had an idea. He thought of the egg sack and the 514 little spiders that would hatch in the spring. If Charlotte herself was unable to go home to the barn, at least he must take her children along. Wilbur rushed to the front of the pen. He put his front feet up on the top board and gazed around. In the distance, he saw the Arbles and the Zuckermans approaching, and he knew that he had to act quickly. "Where's Templeton?" he demanded. "He's in that corner under the straw, asleep," said Charlotte. Wilbur rushed over, pushed his snout under the rat, and tossed him into the air. "Templeton!" screamed Wilbur. "Pay attention!" The rat, surprised out of a sound sleep, looked first dazed and then disgusted. "What kind of monkey shine is this?" he growled. "Can't a rat catch a wink of sleep without being rudely popped into the air?" "Listen to me," said Wilbur. "Charlotte is very ill. She has only a short time to live. She cannot accompany us home because of her condition, and therefore it is absolutely necessary that I take her egg sack with me. I can't reach it, and I can't climb. You are the only one who can get it. There's not a second to be lost. The people are coming. They'll be here in no time. Please, 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 Templeton, climb up and get the egg sack." The rat yawned and straightened his whiskers, and then he looked at the egg sack. "So," he said in disgust, "so it's old Templeton to the rescue, is it? Templeton, do this. Templeton, do that. Templeton, please run down to the dump and get a magazine clipping. Templeton, please lend me a piece of string so I can spin a web." "Oh, hurry," said Wilbur. "Hurry up, Templeton." But the rat was in no hurry. He began imitating Wilbur. "So it's hurry up, Templeton, is it?" he said. "Ho, ho! And what thanks do I ever get for these services, I would like to know? Never a kind word for old Templeton, only abuse and wisecracks and snide remarks. Never a kind word for a rat." "Templeton," said Wilbur in desperation, "if you don't stop talking and get busy, all will be lost and I shall die of a broken heart. Please climb up." Templeton lay back in the straw, and lazily he placed his forearms behind his head and crossed his knees in an attitude of complete relaxation. "Die of a broken heart," he mimicked. "How touching! My, I notice that it's always me you come to when you're in trouble, but I've never heard anyone's heart breaking on my account. Oh, no, who cares anything about old Templeton?" "Get up!" screamed Wilbur. "Stop acting like a spoiled child." Templeton grinned and lay still. "Who made trip after trip to the dump?" he asked. "Why, it was old Templeton." "Who saved Charlotte's life by scaring that Arble boy away with a rotten goose egg? Well, bless my soul, I believe it was old Templeton. Who bit your tail and got you back on your feet this morning after you fainted in front of the crowd? Old Templeton. Has it ever occurred to you that I'm sick of running errands and doing favors? What do you think I am, anyway? A rat of all work?" Wilbur was desperate. The people were coming, and the rat was failing him. Suddenly, he remembered Templeton's fondness for food. "Templeton," he said, "I will make you a solemn promise. Get Charlotte's egg sack for me, and from now on I will let you eat first when Lurvy slaps me. I will let you have your choice of everything in my trough, and I won't touch a thing until you're through." The rat sat up. "You mean that?" he asked. "I promise, cross my heart." "All right, it's a deal," said the rat. And he walked over to the wall and started to climb. His stomach was still swollen from his night's gorge. Groaning and complaining, he pulled himself slowly up to the ceiling. He crept along until he could reach the egg sack. Charlotte moved aside for him. She was dying, but she still had enough strength to move a little. Then Templeton bared his long, ugly teeth and began snipping the threads that fastened the sack to the ceiling. Wilbur watched from below. "Use extreme care," he said. "I don't want a single one of those eggs harmed." This is my mouth," complained the rat. "It's like caramel candy." But Templeton worked away at the job and managed to cut the egg sack adrift and carry it to the ground, where he dropped it in front of Wilbur. Wilbur heaved a great sigh of relief. "Thank you, Templeton," he said. "I will never forget this as long as I live." "Neither will I," said the rat, picking his teeth. "It feels like I just ate a spool of thread." "Home we go," he said. Templeton crept into the crate and buried himself under the straw. He got out of sight just in time, because Lurvy and John Arble and Mr. Zuckerman came along just at that moment, followed by Mrs. Arble and Mrs. Zuckerman and Avery and Fern. Wilbur had already decided how he was going to carry the egg sack. There was really only one way. He carefully took the little bundle in his mouth and held it there on top of his tongue. He remembered that Charlotte had told him that the egg sack was waterproof and strong. It felt funny on his tongue, and it made him drool a bit. And of course, he couldn't say anything. But as he was being shoved into the crate, he looked up at Charlotte and gave her a wink. He knew he was saying goodbye for the last time, but he knew her children were safe. "Goodbye," she whispered, and then she summoned all of her strength and waved one of her front legs at him. She never moved again. Next day, as the Ferris wheel was being taken apart and the racehorses were being loaded into the vans and the entertainers were packing up their belongings and driving away, Charlotte died. The fairgrounds were soon deserted. The sheds and the buildings were empty and forlorn. The infield was littered with bottles and trash. Nobody of the hundreds of people that had visited the fair knew that a gray spider had played the most important part of all. No one was with her when she died. And so, Wilbur came home to his beloved manure pile in the barn cellar. It was a strange homecoming. Around his neck he wore a Medal of Honor, and in his mouth he held a sack of spider eggs. There was no place like home, Wilbur thought, as he placed Charlotte's 514 unborn children carefully in a safe corner. The barn smelled good. His friends, the sheep and the geese, were glad to see him back. The geese gave him a noisy welcome. Congratulations, they called. "Nice work." Mr. Zuckerman took the medal from Wilbur's neck and hung it on a nail over the pig pen, where visitors could examine it. Wilbur himself could look up at it whenever he wanted to. In the days that followed, he was very happy. He grew to be a great size. He never worried about being killed, for he knew that Mr. Zuckerman would keep him as long as he lived. Wilbur often thought of Charlotte. A few strands of her old web still hung in the doorway. Every day Wilbur would stand and look at the torn, empty web, and a lump would come into his throat. No one had ever had such a friend, so affectionate, so loyal, and so skillful. The autumn days grew shorter. Lurvy brought the squash and the pumpkins in from the garden and piled them in the barn floor, where they would not be nipped by the frosty nights. The maples and the birches turned bright red colors, and the wind slowly made them fall from the tree. Under the wild apple trees in the pasture, the little red apples lay thick on the ground, and the sheep gnawed them, and the geese gnawed them, and the foxes came in at night and sniffed them. One evening, just before Christmas, snow began falling. It covered house and barn and fields and woods. Wilbur had never seen snow before. When morning came, he went out and plowed drifts in his yard just for the fun of it. Fern and Avery arrived dragging their sled. They coasted down the lane and out into the frozen pond in the pasture. "Coasting is the most fun there is," said Avery. "The most fun there is," retorted Fern, "is when the Ferris wheel stops at the top and Henry and I are in the top car and Henry makes the car swing back and forth and you can see everything for miles and miles and miles." "Goodness, are you still thinking about that old Ferris wheel?" said Avery in disgust. "The fair was weeks ago." "I think about it all the time," said Fern, picking snow from her ear. After Christmas, the thermometer dropped to 10 below zero. Cold settled on the world. The pasture was bleak and frozen. The cows stayed in the barn all the time now, except on sunny mornings when they went out and stood in the barnyard in lee of the straw pile. The sheep stayed near the barn too for protection, and when they were thirsty, they just ate snow. The geese hung around the barnyard the way boys hang around a drugstore, and Mr. Zuckerman fed them corn and turnips to keep them cheerful. "Many, many, many thanks," they always called when they saw the food coming. Templeton moved indoors when winter came. His ratty home under the pig trough was too chilly, so he fixed himself a cozy nest in the barn behind the grain bins. He lined it with bits of dirty newspapers and rags and whatever he found, trinkets or keepsakes, he carried them home and stored them there. He continued to visit Wilbur 3 times a day, exactly at mealtime, and Wilbur kept the promise he had made. Wilbur let the rat eat first. Then, when Templeton couldn't hold another mouthful, Wilbur would eat. As a result of overeating, Templeton grew bigger and fatter than any rat you have ever seen. He was gigantic. He was as big as a young woodchuck. The old sheep spoke to him about his size one day. "You would live longer," said the old sheep, "if you ate less." "Who wants to live forever?" sneered the rat. "I am naturally a heavy eater, and I get untold satisfaction from the pleasures of the feast." He patted his stomach and grinned at the sheep and crept inside. All winter, Wilbur watched over Charlotte's egg sack as though he were guarding his own children. He had scooped out a special little place in the manure for the sack next to the boards on the fence. On very cold nights, he lay so that his breath would keep them warm. For Wilbur, nothing in life was so important as this small, round object. Nothing else mattered. Patiently, he waited for the end of winter and the coming of the little spiders. Life is always rich and steady when you're waiting for something to happen or to hatch. The winter ended at last. "I heard the frogs today," said the old sheep one evening. "Listen, you can hear them now." Wilbur stood still and cocked his ears. From the pond, he heard the shrill chorus come, the voices of hundreds of little frogs. "Springtime," said the old sheep thoughtfully. "Another spring." And as she walked away, Wilbur saw a new lamb following her. It was only a few hours old. The snows melted and ran away. The streams and the ditches bubbled and clattered with the rushing of water. A sparrow with a streaky breast arrived and sang, and the light strengthened in the mornings. And the mornings came sooner. Almost every morning there was another new lamb in the sheepfold. The goose was sitting on 9 eggs. The sky seemed wider and warm. The last remaining strands of Charlotte's old web floated away and vanished. One fine sunny morning after breakfast, Wilbur stood watching his precious egg sack. He wasn't thinking of anything much. As he had stood there, he noticed something move. He stepped closer and stared. A tiny spider crawled from the sack. It was no bigger than a grain of sand, no bigger than the head of a pin. Its body was gray with a black stripe underneath. Its legs were gray and tan, and it looked just like Charlotte. Wilbur trembled all over when he saw it. The little spider waved at him. When Wilbur looked more closely, 2 more spiders crawled out and waved. They climbed around and around the sack, exploring their new world. Then 3 more little spiders, then 8, then 10. Charlotte's children were here at last. Wilbur's heart pounded. He began to squeal, and he raced in circles, kicking manure into the air. Then he turned a backflip, and he planted his feet down in front of Charlotte's children. "Hello there," he said. The first spider said hello, but its voice was so small Wilbur couldn't hear it. "I am an old friend of your mother's," said Wilbur. "I'm glad to see you. Are you all right? Is everyone all right?" The little spiders waved their forelegs at him. Wilbur could see by the way that they were acting that they were glad to see him. "Is there anything I can get you? Is there anything you need?" The young spiders just waved. For several days and nights they crawled around here and there and up and down, waving at Wilbur and trailing little drag lines behind them. There were dozens and dozens of them. Wilbur couldn't count them, but he knew that he had a great many new friends. They grew quite rapidly. Soon each one was as big as a BB shot. They made tiny little webs near the sack. Then came the quiet morning when Mr. Zuckerman opened the door on the north side. A warm draft of rising air blew softly through the barn cellar. The air smelled of damp earth, of spruce woods, of sweet springtime. The baby spiders felt the warm updraft. One spider climbed to the top of the fence, and then it did something that came as a great surprise to Wilbur. The spider stood on its head, pointed its spinnerets into the air, and let loose a cloud of fine silk. The silk formed a balloon, and as Wilbur watched, the spiders let go of the fence and rose into the air. "Goodbye," it said, as it sailed through the doorway. "Wait a minute!" screamed Wilbur. "Where do you think you're going?" But the spider was already out of sight. Then another baby spider crawled to the top of the fence, stood on its head, and made a balloon and sailed away. Then another spider, and then another. The air was soon filled with tiny balloons, little balloons carrying a spider. Wilbur was frantic. Charlotte's babies were disappearing at a great rate. "Come back, children," he cried. "Goodbye, goodbye," they called. "Goodbye." At last, one little spider took time enough to stop and talk to Wilbur before making its balloon. "We're leaving here on the warm updraft. This is our moment for setting forth. We are aeronauts, and we're going out into the world to make webs for ourselves." "But where?" asked Wilbur. "Wherever the wind takes us, high, low, near, far, east, west, north, south, we take to the breeze. We go as we please." "Are you all going?" asked Wilbur. "You can't all go. I would be all alone with no friends. Your mother wouldn't want that to happen, I'm sure." The air was now so full of balloonists that the barn cellar looked almost as though a mist had gathered. Balloons by the dozen were rising, circling, and drifting away through the door, sailing off on the gentle wind. Cries of "Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye" came weakly to Wilbur's ear. He couldn't bear to watch any more. In sorrow, he just sank to the ground and closed his eyes. This seemed like the end of the world, to be deserted by Charlotte's children. Wilbur cried himself to sleep. When he awoke late that afternoon, he looked up at the egg sack. It was empty. He looked into the air. The balloonists were gone. Then he walked drearily to the doorway where Charlotte's web used to be. He was standing there thinking of her when he heard a small voice. "Salutations," it said. "I'm up here." "So am I," said another voice. "So am I," said a third voice. "Three of us are staying. We like this place, and we like you." Wilbur looked up. At the top of the doorway, 3 small webs were being constructed. On each web, working busily, was one of Charlotte's daughters. "Can I take this to mean," asked Wilbur, "that you have definitely decided to live here in the barn cellar and that I am going to have 3 friends?" "You can indeed," said the spiders. "What are your names, please?" asked Wilbur, trembling with joy. "I'll tell you my name," replied the first little spider, "if you tell me why you're trembling." "I'm trembling with joy," said Wilbur. "Then my name is Joy," said the first spider. What was my mother's middle initial? Asked the second spider. A, said Wilbur. Then my name is Arania, said the spider. How about me, said the third spider. Will you just pick out a nice, sensible name for me? Something not too long, not too fancy, and not too dumb. Wilbur thought hard. Nellie, he suggested. Fine, I like it very much, said the third spider. You can call me Nellie. She daintily fastened her orb line to the next spoke of her web. Wilbur's heart brimmed with happiness. He felt he should make a short speech on this very important occasion. Joy, Arania, Nellie, he began, welcome to the barn cellar. You have chosen a hallowed doorway from which to string your webs. I think it is only fair to tell you that I was devoted to your mother. I owe her my very life. She was brilliant, beautiful, and loyal to the end. I shall always treasure her memory. To you, her daughters, I pledge my friendship forever and ever. I pledge mine too, said Joy. I do too, said Arania. And I do too, said Nellie, who had just managed to catch a small gnat. It was a happy day for Wilbur, and many more happy days followed. As time went on and the months and the years came and went, he was never without friends. Fern did not come regularly to the barn anymore. She was growing up and she was careful to avoid childish things like sitting on a milk stool in a pig pen. But Charlotte's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren year after year lived in the doorway. Each spring there were new little spiders hatching out to take the place of the old ones. Most of them sailed away on their balloons, but always 2 or 3 set up housekeeping in the doorway. Mr. Zuckerman took fine care of Wilbur all the rest of his days, and the pig was often visited by friends and admirers, for nobody ever forgot the year of his triumph and the miracle of the web. Life in the barn was very good. Night and day, winter and summer, spring and fall, dull days and bright days. It was the best place to be, thought Wilbur, this warm, delicious cellar with the geese and the changing seasons and the heat of the sun and the passage of the swallows, the nearness of rats, the sameness of the sheep, the love of spiders, the smell of manure, and the glory of everything. Wilbur never forgot Charlotte. Although he loved her children and grandchildren dearly, none of the spiders ever took her place in his heart. She was in a class all by herself. It is not often that someone comes across a true friend who is a good writer. Charlotte was both. And that is the end of our story called Charlotte's Web, one of my all-time favorite children's books. I hope you have enjoyed the story of Charlotte's Web as well. And our very last activity sheet has a couple of thinking questions. One of them says, why do you think Wilbur wanted to take Charlotte's egg sack back to the farm with him? And how did Wilbur go about getting it? There are a couple of other thinking questions. And then down at the bottom where we're making our connections with Bible truth, it says, Wilbur asked Charlotte why she had done all this for him. He didn't feel like he deserved it. Charlotte said that she did it because she liked Wilbur. He was her friend, and the Bible says that there is no greater love than for a man to give his life for his friend. Jesus gave his life for us. And there are some verses for you to look up here that talk about how Jesus is the best friend of all. Charlotte was a great friend, and Wilbur had great friends in the barn cellar, but Jesus is the best friend of all. And I hope you've enjoyed Charlotte's Web. And this is actually our last story time, but keep posted because we'll probably be putting some other things on from time to time to take the place of story time, and maybe even some videos that help us get ready to come back to Sunday school. So looking forward to seeing you again really soon, and thanks for joining us for Kids Connections.